Hey everyone, this is lecture 5.3, macro level murder. In this one, we're going to be talking about macro level factors relating to murder, namely genocide. We also will be talking about gangs and street crime. This one's almost definitely going to be a little bit shorter. Basically, this is its own lecture to keep the other lectures from being as long. So, when we think about murder, it is typically on the micro level. So we think about, why did this person kill that person, right? However, sociologists are also interested in how environment and macro level effects can also encourage murder. Sociologists have found that standards of a social setting or subculture can have major impacts on the types of violence present in a society, a culture, or a subculture. There are many ways in which a setting can cause or influence what violence looks like. We're going to look at, in the following slides, gang violence and also war zones. So, setting, one example of setting cause violence is street gangs. In street gangs, basically we usually have somewhere around a dozen, maybe 2 dozen young men, typically between the ages of 15 to 19. You will remember that that is kind of the golden zone for when men kill other people. Uh, and in this situation, we see raw violence. Violence that is illegal, antisocial, and irrational. And sure, antisocial and irrational are absolutely uh, social constructions, but that doesn't mean it's not real as well. If you compare this with organized violence, as on the next slide, when we're looking at war itself, raw violence is perpetrated kind of outside of the rules of the dominant society. That's a big distinguisher between gang violence and war, is effectively gang violence is war on the micro or sometimes meso scale. In his Code of the Street thesis, Elijah Anderson, and this was in 1999, observed that violence in African American neighborhoods is caused by a subculture that allows those who share its understanding to know how to use violence, when to maintain that violence, and personal status, respect, etc. It should absolutely be noted that this is not only applicable to African American neighborhoods, it also is absolutely applicable to other situations. We saw some of this violence surrounding organized crime surrounding Italian Americans in the mid 20th century. We saw this with Jewish gangs in New York in the late 1800s. We saw it with Irish gangs in New York also during that period. Really, though, the difference is it's small-scale warfare, and within those violent countercultures, we have specific rules of what is and is not okay, who can and can't be considered a target, right? So if you've seen The Godfather, you're kind of familiar with some of those ideas, right? This kind of guy, he's involved in the mafia. He broke the rules, and so we're gonna kill him. That's that kind of concept of the code of the street. Just with Anderson, he's talking about African American neighborhoods that he specifically was observing. In terms of street gangs, we have these other concepts known as concentrated disadvantage and collective efficacy. You'll see in these slides a couple of the terms are highlighted. Those are just kind of from my personal notes. Don't take any special interest in those. That's just kind of a typo, I suppose. Concentrated disadvantage, then, relating to street gangs, is the difference in criminal violence between racial groups that has a coercive effect on social integration. Again, when we look at those previous versions of gang warfare in the 20th century, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, and then African Americans in the late 20th century, all of those groups at that moment, in their moments, or rather, we're suffering prejudice and a lack of social integration, right? So where we have disadvantage, where we have large groups of people being collectively oppressed, you could posit then that you're going to have this kind of gang warfare. Another movie that, again, it's not entirely historic, but it is interesting for understanding the concept. I believe it was made in the early 2000s, called Gangs of New York, with Leo DiCaprio and that other guy. That's also another really good example there. We also have this concept known as collective efficacy, which is the ability of community residents to control public spaces in which they live. So areas with concentrated disadvantage tend to have low levels of collective efficacy, which makes perfect sense, right? You have a disadvantaged, unprivileged group that is perpetually discriminated against. So of course, those groups will not be able to advocate for themselves as well as the dominant powers in society. So how can you apply this? Basically, if you would want to help a area with high degrees of concentrated disadvantage and maybe high degrees of street gangs, as an alternate to putting a bunch of young kids in jail, you could try to improve the political power, political community organization within those communities, and then it won't specifically stop one specific murder, but over time it will change the environment of the overall community and kind of work through some of these problems. You see in the 1970s a lot of phenomena surrounding the Black Panther Party. They were trying to build that degree of collective efficacy, even though they were kind of a demonized group. We also see this in community organizing of the early 2000s era. Also, Barack Obama's era of community organizing was very much about this kind of concept. Now, war zones. Let's look at that. War zones include organized violence, which is normal and normative. Do not confuse organized violence with organized crime. That's a different behavior. Organized violence occurs frequently and is well integrated into society. So it can include war and war zones, but it can also include violence that is perpetrated by police forces. If a police force is consistently violent, regardless of whether that violence is justified or not, we can classify it then as being organized violence. So many of these terms, right, this is kind of how sociology works, is neutral for the sake of observation. This is not a judgment call on is police violence good or bad, but it is classified as being organized violence. Lucifer effect then, it occurs when ordinary people are put into this phrasing is weird. I'll clarify. I'm sorry. That's not that great. When ordinary people are put into situations where they become capable of committing really reprehensible acts. Let's state that a different way. Ordinary people are put into a social setting that kind of manipulates them into being really violent, gross people, or it allows those qualities to come out of them. If you want a better example of that, go look into the Stanford Prison Experiment. And one major way that the Stanford Prison Experiment was very, very broken when it occurred, and was a highly unethical experiment, was part of because it really effectively created an environment where really very bad human behavior became permissible, right? So we see Lucifer effect occurring in war zones. We see Lucifer effect occurring in prisons both by the prison inmates and also by the prison guards that are put into that position of being a monster. We also see Lucifer effect kick in corrupted police forces, etc. Genocide then. Genocide is macro-scale killing of a racial or ethnic group. And within genocide, the perpetrators of the killing have the job of killing others under orders. Many historic instances of genocide after the fact, people defend themselves by saying, listen, I was just doing what I was told to do. I was just following orders. And in those situations, it becomes very, very difficult to figure out who was wrong. The Nuremberg trials following World War II were a very good example of this, where there were teams of international prosecutors trying to figure out, okay, we have a whole country that was dedicated to murdering millions and millions of people. The scale of that makes it nearly impossible to truly figure out who was to blame and who was not to blame. It's a very thorny issue, as thorny as the Holocaust was ugly. Similarly, in genocide situations, bystanders who are average citizens who are not being targeted by the genocide, we now understand typical human behavior, not to say it's good or bad, but typical human behavior in those situations when you are not being threatened, but somebody else is being a subject to genocide, is to do nothing. That is something that humans do. And understanding how to enable non-threatened populations to advocate for people in their society who did nothing. That's a big question on how we do it effectively. The more power that a government has, the greater its ability to carry out killing on a large scale. So because the government in Nazi Germany was highly authoritarian, and it was dominated by one political party, the Nazi Party, then they were able to perpetrate that genocide on a mass scale. Similarly, there is some historic debate over what the United States did to Native Americans in the 1800s was truly genocide. That's really much more of a technical argument, but if you are classifying that as genocide, you absolutely see the same dynamic. We did have multiple political parties in the United States during that era, but the victims of the genocide, Native Americans, were not represented at all within those machinations of government. So thus, without that ability to advocate for themselves, it made them easier victims, if you will. And this is another reason why democracy is a very good thing. Pluralism, where all parties have a say in democracy, is very, very important. And as responsible citizens, we all have to do our best to keep that going. Okay, so that is the end of this mediumly short lecture. You have any questions, just let me know.